Welcome everyone to this video analysing the first poem in William Blake's anthology Songs of Innocence, published in 1779. The poem itself is called Introduction and very much sets out his intentions for the rest of his anthology. Now, this video is being created to help students with their WJEC studies at A level, and it's Unit 3 that we're focusing on particularly. Before we take a look and start analysing the poem itself, I want you to have a look at the two engravings on the screen. On the left-hand side is the frontispiece, and you'll see the piper looking up towards the sky, and he sees this angelic figure, this divine inspiration, this form of a child that seems to give him the creativity necessary to write his poems. He's holding his instrument in his hands. That musical instrument, I think, is quite important. And on the right-hand side of that piper, you can see the tree itself seems to be woven around. And you've got two parts of that tree. And perhaps those two parts of that tree, one of them perhaps is the innocence that is spoken of. And perhaps the second part is the experience. And in this poem, we do get this weaving together of the more experienced piper and the more innocent child in the cloud. I also want to draw your attention to behind the piper, and you'll see a flock of sheep. Now that very much sets up this poem as a poem that focuses on a pastoral landscape, and we'll talk about pastoral poetry as the video progresses. I also like the fact that the piper has no shoes on at all, connecting himself with nature, and when we take a look at romantic poetry, you'll see that connection between mankind and nature more clearly. On the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see the poem itself in its original form. And again, I want you to take a look at the twisted tree that seems to be on both sides of that poem, and it creates this kind of floral canopy above the poem. Inside some of those arches, you can see some figures very faintly. And you've got this connection between mankind and nature that I think is possibly worth analysing as we take a look at the poem itself. Now that we've taken a look at the visual representation of the poem, I'd like to read the poem to you to get a feel of what this poem may be revealing. Piping down the valleys wild, piping songs of pleasant glee, on a cloud I saw a child, and he laughing said to me, "Pipe a song about a lamb." So I piped with merry cheer. "Piper, pipe that song again." So I piped. He wept to hear. "Drop thy pipe, thy happy pipe, sing thy songs of happy cheer." So I sung the same again, while he wept with joy to hear. "Piper, sit thee down and write in a book that all may read." So he vanished from my sight, and I plucked a hollow reed, and I made a rural pen, and I stained the water clear, and I wrote my happy songs every child may joy to hear. Now, before we start unpicking the language and revealing what Blake wants us to see, I'd like to take a minute and have a look at poetic form, and then move on to rhyme scheme and meter, because as you conduct your exam answers in the first part of section A, you do need to understand how a poem is constructed, and you need to be able to reveal your understanding of assessment objective 1 and 2, which means understanding how the poem is put together and what that reveals through language, form and structure. So I think it's worth a little bit of time making sure that you understand how it's constructed. And this will lead us on perfectly to taking a look at where this poetic form might come from, which will allow us to open up a conversation about literary tradition, and that will definitely help us with our AO3 for part 2 of section A. So the poetic form of this poem can be diagnosed as a lyric, in particular a pastoral lyric. Lyrics are short, often very rhythmic poems, and they focus on expressing an emotion. Lyric poems used to be sung and put to music. And during Blake's lifetime, he often used to sing his poetry aloud to friends and to family. What Blake does is engages with a type of poem called pastoral lyrics. And pastoral poetry can often be attributed to ancient Greek poets like Theocritus. And he wrote poems that looked back at a particular time in history, a time perhaps where the world was a little bit better, where the world was a little bit more natural, where the relationship between mankind and nature was a little less tainted. Now, Theocritus was writing about the golden age of man, and I think it's important that we see that William Blake is dissatisfied with the world that he's living in. He's dissatisfied that the Industrial Revolution is causing untold destruction on the environment. It's causing huge amounts of pollution. It's destroying the natural landscape. We have increasing urbanization. And like Theocritus, he looks back at a simpler time, perhaps where we had a better relationship with the world rather than during the late 1700s when William Blake was writing. Now, Theocritus's poems often idealize the lives of shepherds and agrarian lifestyles where man takes something from nature but also gives back. And this image of the ancient Greek place of Arcadia, where you did have that perfect harmony between mankind and nature, I think William Blake is engaging with those ideas and perhaps suggesting that the way to truly understand the world is not by looking forward through scientific understanding or more technological engagement, but actually looking back to a time where perhaps we had it a little bit better. So the idea of shepherds and the idea of an engagement with nature has got to be important. And also the poem after introduction is called The Shepherd. The third poem of the anthology, The Echoing Green, also has this green space, this perfect pastoral image that perhaps has been untainted by mankind's fingertips. Pastoral poetry is a deliberately simpler form. There are lots of different types of poem he could write. He could have engaged with writing an ode, or he could have engaged in writing an epic poem, but he's deliberately chosen a pastoral poem. And pastoral poetry is often self-conscious in the fact that it's less prestigious, it's less impressive, it's less grand. And poets like Theocritus seem to know that they will not equal the achievement of some of the great Greek poets like Homer or playwrights like Sophocles, so they don't dare to take on the epic and mythological themes that occupied those writers. And instead, they present their work as humble reworkings of the themes of their predecessors' writing. So, for example, where Homer dedicates a massive passage of the Iliad to describing the hero Achilles' shield, and that shield is made by Hephaestus the god and was inscribed with elaborate scenes representing human life, Theocritus would spend much more time simply describing the engravings on a wooden cup. Now, in pastoral poetry, there is a real sense of not trying to engage with the epic grandeur and perhaps focus on a much simpler scene, a much simpler story, a much simpler idea to show the simplicity of life. And that can reveal that we've actually got a long way away from simplicity and we're living very complex lives which are quite unnatural. Again, with the Industrial Revolution in full swing, perhaps William Blake is writing pastoral poetry to show we've come really far away from our roots, and perhaps it's time to return to a simpler way of life. There are different types of pastoral poetry. One of these would be where a poet discusses life in the country and the life of a shepherd. Secondly, when poets describe the country with an implicit or explicit contrast to the urban. And finally, poets can use pastoral poetry to depict country life in a derogatory manner too. When I read Introduction and when I read Shepherd and when I read The Echoing Green, I think we've definitely got that focus on agrarian lifestyles, on countryside, but by not mentioning the urbanization and the pollution and the corruption of cities, I think Blake, like many other pastoral poets, is deliberately contrasting the modern world with a more idealistic world, showing us the evils of what's happening in contemporary society. Now let's take a look at the poetic meter. When we start considering the poetic meter of a particular poem, sometimes we'll notice that some syllables are stressed syllables and some syllables are much softer and that they're unstressed syllables. Now I've got two particular symbols that I've put on your screen. I've got that red slash and then I've got the green U shape. Now those will connote stressed syllables and unstressed syllable. And as we start diagnosing the meter, you'll see that it's actually fairly regular through this poem. So as we read this first couple of lines, you'll see piping down the valleys wild, piping songs of pleasant glee. Now, as I've read that, you'll probably see that the first syllable is a stressed syllable, followed by the unstressed syllable, piping. In the next part, piping down the valleys wild, follows the stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed meter. Now the final part of the line is a single stressed syllable. Now we almost expect there to be a second unstressed syllable to finish it off into the pattern that we've got, but this continues into the next line. Piping songs of pleasant glee. So the meter we have seems to be one stressed followed by one unstressed syllable, and we seem to have four patterns of that. The final one of the pattern, there's a missing unstressed syllable. We can diagnose the meter for this poem as trochaic tetrameter. Now that might be the first time you've heard that term, so just to break it down, the way I always remember what a trochee is the sound of the word trochee actually reveals its meaning. Trochee. A trochee is one stressed syllable followed by an unstressed syllable. Very frequently in poetry, you'll actually see the opposite of that. You'll see an unstressed followed by a stressed syllable. Those are called iambs. And again, the sound I am will reveal what that meter will be. I am, I am, I am. This time it's the opposite. It's trochee, trochee, trochee. Now the word tetrameter means a line of poetry made up of four metrical feet. In this case, the metrical foot are those two syllables that go together, the stressed followed by unstressed. So what we have is trochaic tetrameter with a missing unstressed syllable at the end of each line. As you can see, it's fairly similar all the way through the poem. We have that constant trochee, trochee, trochee sound, and each line seems to finish on that stressed syllable. Now that's completely irrelevant unless we consider why that might have been the case. Now for me, that pattern of trochee, trochee, trochee creates it almost into this bouncing beat that's almost nursery rhyme in the way that it's presented. And as we take a look at the rhyme scheme, you'll see a continuation of that quite humble and quite satisfying nursery rhyme structure. Now the rhyme scheme is worth taking a look because it adds to that metrical understanding. Here I have the poem once more, and this time the colours will denote where those rhymes might be. So as you can see in the first stanza, wild and child, perfect rhymes, and glee and me, also perfect rhymes. And it gives us this very satisfying culmination of those rhyming sounds, which, like a nursery rhyme or like a lullaby, kind of gives us that sense of peace, of that sense of harmony, of that sense of belonging too. Now you'll notice in the second and the third and the fifth, we have a slightly varied rhyme scheme. So we drop the 2 rhymes per stanza and then we move into just 1 rhyme per stanza. So lamb and again, pipe and again do not rhyme, but cheer and hear do, cheer and hear do, read, write and cite, and then clear and hear. Now, whilst the rhyme scheme might not continue all the way through the poem like we saw in the first stanza, we do also have this continuing rhyming throughout the stanzas too, again creating a very harmonious and quite a satisfying and quite a soothing type of rhyme scheme. The first stanza, we can say that the rhyme scheme is a perfect A, B, A, B, and then it varies in the second stanza, C, D, E, D, and then changes slightly as the poem progresses. Taking a look at the rhyme scheme and the meter helps us to attain those AO1 and AO2 marks on that WJEC rhyme mark scheme. But if we wanted to link some contextual information here, I think William Blake might have been inspired by some of the songs and some of the hymns he would have heard throughout the late 1700s and the early 1800s. Now, this idea of nursery rhyme, I think that nursery rhyme simplicity is a clear choice that he's made. He could have written in a far more complex or far more sophisticated dialect if he wanted to. But I think he's deliberately chosen that simplicity because not only does it match the innocence that we see in the poem, but it also allows his poetry to be a little bit more engaging to younger people and also to the common man who might not have been highly educated at the time. Now, he was probably inspired by the music of 2 quite strong figures. The one on the left called John Wesley and the one on the right, Isaac Watts. In the early 18th century, Isaac Watts wrote divine songs. And in those songs that he was presenting to the world, he used his music to educate, and it was to educate the masses about being spiritual and being a moral person, and also the relationship that humanity has with the divine, with God, with heaven. He aimed to make religious concepts more accessible to children. And he frequently emphasized the virtues of childhood and the importance of a pure heart. And those 2 points I think are really important because all the way through Blake's poetry, there's a real focus on childhood and the innocence that goes along with childhood and how easy it is to pierce that bubble and to drag people out of their innocence and into a world that's much less satisfying, that world of experience. Now, Watts often wrote about the joys of innocence, but also the need for moral guidance. And throughout Blake's poetry, we can almost see him, excusing the pun, of shepherding people towards what he feels would be a more satisfying existence. And while Watts maintained a conventional Christian perspective, I think in Blake's poetry it often became a little bit more challenging. And when he wrote about religion and he wrote about society, he developed that more radical side than Watts's music would have shown at the time. But you can see the influence of Watts's music on this poem. And secondly, John Wesley's poetry would also have been an inspiration. He was a prolific hymn writer, and his works were aimed at making religious ideas accessible to the common people. He often incorporated lively rhythms and memorable melodies that could easily be sung in a congregational setting. And I think when we talked about the trochaic tetrameter, that lively rhythm could be a reference to John Wesley's lively rhythms throughout his works. Now, Wesley was also really committed to social reform, and he was passionately advocating for the poor and the marginalized. And as we look through these poems, you'll see that Blake often does this. He gives a voice to those people who are oppressed. When we look at The Little Black Boy, or when we look at Holy Thursday, you can see that there are people in the world who need a voice, and Blake allows their voice to be heard a little bit more. You can see it quite clearly in Chimney Sweepers. John Wesley often utilized really vivid imagery and emotive language, again, something that I think you can see in Blake's poetry. And he focused on community and social responsibility. And I think throughout Blake's poetry, there is a suggestion that those people who are experienced do have a responsibility not to pierce the innocent bubble of those who have yet to reach that innocence, but actually to guide them toward experience without destroying their chance at happiness. And you can see that quite clearly in poems like The Schoolboy, or you can see it in the figure of Old John in The Echoing Green. John Wesley believed that Christians could achieve a state where the love of God reigned supreme in their hearts, giving them not only outward but inward holiness. And I think throughout Blake's poetry you can see that focusing on being a good person, not just looking like a good person. And in some of his poetry he reveals how charities may not be as benevolent as they may suggest on the outside. I think again you can see that he's borrowed those ideas from John Wesley too. Now that we've taken a look at the poetic form and considered where that poetic form might have had a contextual inspiration, and we've taken a look at the meter and the rhyme scheme, I think it's now time to start deconstructing the poem and really analysing the language that Blake uses as a vehicle to share his ideas. Now, the first stanza starts with "piping down the valleys wild," and it's a very clear image that he seems to be conjuring. We've got an image of someone who is wandering down a valley path and they're creating music. The word piping here, that continuous verb piping, it shows that the music that's being created is spontaneous and it's creative, and this piper is not creating music for a purpose. This piper is simply occupying his mind by creating interesting and intricate and quite natural music purely to entertain himself. Now we get an image here perhaps of a set of pipes, or perhaps a single pipe like we saw in the engraving, but the word piping probably conjures this image of an ancient Greek figure. The pipes themselves are quite an archaic type of instrument, something that we might see in ancient Greece like a lute or a lyre. And this image creates this very natural music. It's not synthetic in any way. And it seems completely sensible that someone who is wandering through a valley would play this type of instrument, because the instrument itself is made out of things that you might find in a valley. So we get this really lovely harmony between the person playing the music and the music coming from this natural place. Now, what I'd like to take you to next is perhaps some contextual understanding of pipes and the types of music that's created, because I think there is a reference here to the Greek mythology that Blake would have been very well aware of. Now, Pan was a god, and him as a Greek god, he was the god of the wild and of shepherds and flocks and of rustic music and impromptus, music that's created quite naturally. Now you can see the word shepherds and flocks instantly stand out, because that's the type of image that we've got in this Arcadian type of location that we're reading about. Now his homeland was in rustic Arcadia, this utopian place where mankind and nature seem to be able to live in harmony without one destroying the other. And he's also recognized as being the god of fields and groves and wooded glens. Pan is a symbol of fertility and the season of spring, And I think that works perfectly with the poem that we're reading, because this poem is about that ability for creativity to capture hold of you. So you can create something beautiful and create something meaningful from that divine inspiration that comes from above. The season of spring, I think, is important too. You've got that idea of growth, and you've got this angelic child who comes from the sky, and they've got their whole life ahead of them, and they're going to grow into this world. They might be in a state of innocence now, but eventually they will end up as an experienced human. So you've got these ideas that I think hark really nicely with the poem that we're reading. Now, it isn't a surprise that we see references to Greek mythology when it comes to a poet who might be considered a romantic poet. There were lots of romantic poets who used Greek mythology all the way through their work, in particular the poetry of John Keats. So Keats is frequently referencing the rivers of the underworld, or an ancient Grecian pot that he sees images of when he thinks of a different time. Now, I've put a picture of the philosopher John Locke on your screen too, because John Locke was writing before Blake's time, and Blake definitely read the essay that I'm referencing here. And in 1689, he wrote Essay Concerning Human Understanding. Now, as a romantic poet, Blake fought against the scientific revolution and the age of enlightenment, where the belief that science and reason are the way to gain true understanding. The Romantics didn't believe that science or technology was the way to really get to understanding. Because instead of valuing intellectual reason as the highest intellectual ability, they believed that imagination and creativity were the pinnacle of human virtues. They believed that through music and poetry and art, that's how you really see the inner workings of a human being, not simply in what they're composed of biologically. Now, the Romantic poets often looked to pre-industrialized civilizations like ancient Greece to reveal the corruption 18th century England was facing. And I would argue that Blake shows us a time before the factories and the mills, before the technology that comes along and the steam engines. I think he shows us a time before Industrial Revolution, and he uses that to juxtapose what the world is like for him at that time. Now, Blake lived almost his entire life in London, in the middle of filth and squalor. He would have seen people living in horrible conditions. He would have seen the Thames completely polluted. He will have seen vagrants on the streets, people begging. He would have seen the traffic through the city. He would have seen how difficult the world had become. And by showing us this ancient Greek image of a man walking through a valley, simply enjoying his place in the world, I think he shows us that perhaps as the antidote. The antidote to Industrial Revolution perhaps is to look back at ancient Greece and see that, yes, we can still have understanding in science, we can still have intellectual curiosity, but it doesn't have to be at the expense of the natural world. It's important here to show the literary tradition that Blake seems to sit in. Now, I've put Blake at the very left-hand side of your screen to show that Blake, of all of these figures, is the one who is perhaps first. Now, Blake is often considered a first-generation romantic, but others would disagree and almost consider him pre-romantic, because William Blake lived his entire life in London and doesn't necessarily just favour the natural world, whereas Wordsworth and Coleridge, also first-generation romantics, were much more focused in revealing that perhaps it's the natural world that have all of the answers that we're looking for. I've also put on your screen Shelley, Byron and Keats, who are second-generation romantics. I wanted you to see that Blake was very much part of the movement of the first-generation romantics, or even pre-romanticism. Just to show you the difference between first-generation romantics and second-generation romantics, first-generation romantics saw nature as this uncorrupted world that could inspire, and it could offer inspiration and spiritual renewal. First generation romantics saw nature as the answer to a lot of the problems that the world was facing, and how in the late 1700s and early 1800s, perhaps we were placing far too much energy on urbanization and far too much energy on technological revolution, and maybe we should have stepped back a little and protected the natural world around us. First generation romantics felt that imagination was the pinnacle of all human abilities, far more than John Locke's theories of reason and rational thought and Immanuel Kant's views on what understanding is. And the first generation romantics were really rebelling against the Industrial Revolution. They saw it as an evil and they wanted to halt it, they wanted to turn it round. The first generation romantics were much more political than some of the second generation romantics, and they saw hope in political revolution. They saw what happened in the American Revolution and they saw the French Revolution, and they felt that that was something that could actually lead to better social equality, to allow people to thrive and develop rather than having a really strict hierarchical structure that kept poor people at the bottom and rich people at the top. So they saw that with enthusiasm and optimism. And if you look at the context of Blake, Blake was radical in his political views. He believed that England should go through a revolution and perhaps abandon its monarchy. First generation romantics are very introspective. They very much look inside themselves to find those answers. And they championed the ordinary man. And they wrote simply because they wanted to share those ideas, not just with the educated elite, but with all people. And you can see that Blake's poetry is written in this very simple style. Now, the second generation romantics were much more focused on intense emotions and passionate feelings. They often looked back to Greek civilization as a time where mankind had a better relationship with the world. And the second generation romantics were less optimistic than the first generation. They became quite disillusioned about change. They saw the French Revolution and its failures. And instead, they looked to other countries for escape. So Byron, for example, ended up going out to Greece to be involved in some political battles over there. Now, as we continue, you can see piping down gave us these ideas of joy and pleasure and evoked those images of Pan, perhaps escaping the Industrial Revolution and bringing us back to a world where magic still exists. The next word I'd like to take a look at is the image of valleys. Now, valleys are really natural places. This is very much in juxtaposition to urbanized London, where Blake was living at the time. And it's a very pastoral landscape, the type of thing that Theocritus might write about. And if you think of what a valley actually is, valleys are naturally protected from the harshness of weather. So valleys actually can be seen as a place of protection. Yes, a place of natural wonder and splendor, but also a place that's actually quite well defended. And when things are protected, then things can flourish too. So this isn't a place of potential attack. This isn't a place of danger. This is a place that is protected enough for the natural kind of wilderness to survive and thrive. Now, the post-modifying adjective wild gives us this second idea, where this valley, this natural place, seems to be full of wonder and inspiration. I mean, the word wild could be dangerous and angry and frustrated, but actually, I'd argue it's more a place of excitement and potential. This place has grown wild, which means it's been allowed to develop naturally, rather than being excessively manicured and turned into a lawn or turned into rose bushes. Everything has been allowed to thrive without mankind getting involved and ruining it. So I've placed on the screen the words untainted by mankind's fingertips. And if you take a look at the modern world, it's very difficult to argue that mankind hasn't touched nearly all natural spaces that exist in the world. So this is a place of natural splendor and natural wonder. So from that first line, we've got a very clear, quite vivid image of the setting. Now I'd like to introduce you to this term, locus amenus. And to supplement this, I've placed an image on the right-hand side by Haggart. And you've got this idea that the world has really beautiful places. Now, locus amenus means a pleasant place. Because locus amenus is an idyllic landscape, typically containing trees and shade, maybe a grassy meadow, running water, songbirds, and cool breezes. And this is a typical trope of some poetry where they create this idyllic, euphoric world and show us perhaps this is the antidote to the existence that we're living in 1789. Now, locus amenus were frequently used by ancient Greek poets. Homer's descriptions of the grotto of Calypso and the garden of Alcinous, the rural setting for the dialogue in Plato's Phaedrus, was much imitated, and Theocritus and Virgil also created pastorals that featured landscapes, and they form the backdrop of songs and loves of shepherds. This perfect nature is also the setting for the innocence of the Golden Age. Now, the place that we're shown at the beginning of this poem is quite an innocent, untainted, almost virginal world that hasn't been destroyed yet by mankind. To show you a more English version of the locus amenus, here you can see this image where country life and mankind can live in harmony. You've got the image of the stately home in the background, and then yet you've got the quite idyllic and peaceful cows at the front. Yes, you've got the fence that seems to pen them in, but it isn't destroying their existence either. In this image, mankind and the natural world can coexist. And perhaps in 1789, the scales had tipped more towards destruction rather than harmony. In this description, we could describe almost like the Garden of Eden. I'm going to use the word Eden-esque. There is an Eden-esque image at the beginning of this poem, this place of perfect paradise, almost too good to be true, created for us as a gift. And then as the story of Eden goes, perhaps it's mankind that maybe takes away some of that innocence and leads us in a place of dissatisfaction. We can also describe this as an Arcadian image, again harking back to the ancient Greek times where mankind and nature are in greater harmony. Just to show you the difference, this is the existence of 1789. Okay, it's a more modern image, but this is, in my mind, the type of consequences of Industrial Revolution. And what Blake is doing is juxtaposing that with the image from his poem, suggesting that, well, one of these is clearly superior, and yet why are we continuing to taint the world when we could coexist in a much more natural state? And again, with today's world, we could even take a look at the idea of overpopulation. In our world, we have a huge amount of humans on the planet, and yet we could have this much nicer, calmer, more utopic experience if we perhaps focused on nature rather than constantly striving for unadulterated progress. Now, I'd like to push that one step further because Romantic poets often used an idea of a romantic bower. Now, the term romantic bower is used to describe a location of pastoral perfection where nature feeds creativity and inspiration. So you'll often see in Romantic poetry a perfect, beautiful, sometimes quite wild, sometimes quite rustic, sometimes quite threatening, sometimes quite perfect, sometimes quite peaceful, but a place of nature where inspiration can happen. You can see it in John Keats's poetry quite frequently. He sits underneath this perfect tree, he listens to the song of a nightingale, and that inspires his poetry. And here you can see that Blake, through the valley, can hear this music, can see this person, can talk to these angels, and it's through that romantic bower that creativity and inspiration can really flourish. And again, the argument is mankind is destroying these bowers, and the more bowers we destroy, the less chance we have at creating something beautiful. Romantic poets took these ideas of romantic bowers, and they very often lean on the poetry of Edmund Spenser, who often used that motif of a perfect natural place that inspires. So some of the romantic poets would have been inspired by Edmund Spenser's poetry. Push this one step further. In the early 1800s and the late 1700s, there was a renewed focus in what is known as the sublime. So to introduce what the romantic sublime is, it's when you have a scene which is almost terrifying in its impressive natural state. So natural phenomena that really show power and wilderness and maybe even danger. So you get frequent scenes using, ridiculously imposing mountains or fiery volcanoes or storms in the sea, like you can see in the image from Friedrich. You've got these images that are so powerful that it almost makes you stand back and think, wow, this is the power of God. This is far too impressive to just be understood through biology or chemistry like the Enlightenment thinkers would ask us to. And this was really relevant when Blake was writing, because Edmund Burke published a text called Philosophical Inquiries into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and Beautiful in 1757, so just before Blake's time. And Edmund Burke was arguing that images that are not just beautiful, but are terrifyingly beautiful in their grandeur and power, that's the best way to get real understanding. That's to consider, how impressive God is, because it's almost beyond our comprehension. It makes us feel really small. It makes us feel insignificant in the sublime power of God's creation. The second line continues with the exact same word. It says, piping songs of pleasant glee. Here we have the word piping, which continues this anaphora, which we'll see later on in the poem too, but again really emphasizes just how spontaneous and carefree this piper is. He's playing the music, he has no plans on stopping, he's simply enjoying the music that he's creating. Really unadulterated, there's no purpose behind his music, it's just for his own entertainment. And he's piping songs of pleasant glee. I'd like to just focus on the word songs because the word songs has connotations of happiness and energy. And I'd like to focus just for 1 second because the initial focus is on music. It's not necessarily on words and poetry and rhyme and meter and structure. It's very much this really ephemeral music. Ephemeral means it only exists for a second and then disappears. It's not been trapped or written down just yet. It's not been restricted by numbers. It's not been restricted by recording in a really logical and methodical or mathematical fashion. These are interesting energy inducing songs. And he's piping songs of pleasant glee. Again, the word songs is plural too, showing that this is music that evolves and changes and it adapts as this person's mood might adapt. And those songs are of pleasant glee. And I really like the term pleasant glee because it's a suggestion that this piper is not forced to create this music at all, and it creates this really natural image. The experience that he's having as he's wandering through these valleys is euphoric, it's perfect. And his music is purely for pleasure, which means it's quite an innocent type of music. It's like the type of person who doesn't even know they're singing to themselves. There's something really quite pure and innocent doing something without even know that you're doing it. So it creates the idea that music is created really naturally because inside of human beings there is inspiration. And there is that creative outflowing that is present at all times. So it's quite pure and it's quite unadulterated at this point in the poem. On a cloud I saw a child. Now it's not the type of place you'd normally see a child, in the clouds or on a cloud, but the imagery that we get from on a cloud is one of heavenly imagery. We associate clouds with angels and godliness. So we can probably suggest then that This child he sees in the cloud is divine inspiration. This is where inspiration comes from, not just nature, but it comes from heaven too. This is almost God who is sharing these ideas with this person, and therefore it allows him to get to this more perfect state of creative expression. So on a cloud, I saw a child. And the imagery of children will repeat itself all the way through Blake's anthology. And here you can see that if this child is in the clouds, he equates childhood with angelic qualities. And I think that's really important because he sees in childhood innocence, and he sees purity, and he sees creatures that are not yet tainted by what the world has become. Now, during the late 1700s, child mortality rates was quite high, so people did see children as blessings. And it says that, and he, laughing, said to me. So the child in the sky that he sees out of nowhere is laughing. And I think that laughing again kind of adds to that pleasant glee image we saw just now. Again, this child is taking real joy from the music that he hears. He takes pleasure in that music, and he's enjoying how spontaneous and how carefree this person is entertaining themselves. There's nothing sinister there. It's not laughing at him, looking down at him. It's laughing because he's really enjoying what he hears. And he, laughing, said to me. Now, that child then directs the musician. It's the child who speaks first. The child appears out of his own volition, and the child is the person who decides to speak to the musician. And what we'll see later on in the poem is the musician is willing to follow the instruction of the child. Now that is kind of contravenes the normal suggestion in how adults and children interact. Normally adults are the authority figure and they will often tell children what to do, and the role of the child is to be docile and to be humble and to accept direction. But here the piper is willing to take the instruction of the child because in the child he sees something that is worth listening to. Now, throughout Blake's life, he claimed to see angels. Now, one of the angels he frequently says he'd see would be that of his youngest brother, Robert. And in February of 1787, his brother Robert fell ill, probably with consumption like lots of people at the time. And Blake desperately looked after him as his brother lay dying. But when his brother died, Blake believed that he saw a vision of his spirit ascend heavenwardly and through the ceiling and clapping his hands for joy. He believed he saw his brother's spirit leave his mortal body and enter the ethereal world. This was something he claimed throughout his life. Throughout Blake's childhood, he witnessed visions. His first vision was at 4 years old when he saw God's face at his bedroom window. The first vision he could actually remember occurred whilst walking near his home. He looked up and saw a tree filled with angels, bright angelic wings bespangling every bough like stars. When he told his parents about what he had seen, he only narrowly escaped a beating from his father for telling lies, only because his mother intervened and stopped him. Another vision he claims to have seen was when he saw haymakers working and saw angelic figures walking amongst them. Another time his mother beat him for claiming he saw the prophet Ezekiel under a tree in the fields. Now all the way through his life, not just in childhood, Blake believed he saw a different world, a world that went alongside our mortal world, a world that most people had shut themselves off so they aren't able to perceive it. He felt he was always in touch with this other world that actually needed to be seen. And he really did feel like these visions were from God. He felt like the words that he had to speak, the ideas, the lessons he wanted to teach really did come from God. He felt he was a prophet, a prophetic poet that needed to share his views with the world. Second stanza begins with the words of the child. Pipe a song about a lamb. And you can see that exclamatory sentence begins with the word pipe. The child very much directs the musician. The imperative verb there shows that this child believes that he can improve the piper's work by giving it a sense of direction, by giving it a subject. And so he makes it about a lamb. He says, I'd like to hear a song about a lamb, so sing me a song of a lamb. That's a very clear direction. And the piper is willing to take that direction and to change his music into something perhaps with a bit more meaning. So that song, that spontaneous outburst of emotion at the beginning of the poem, begins to morph into what the child wants. So a subject is given to that spontaneous music, and it shapes it into something slightly different. And the imagery of a lamb has very clear associations and symbolisms and connotations. A lamb symbolizes innocence, which links back to the child we saw in heaven, of purity, and perhaps being naive as well, because lambs are unaware of their future suffering. We know what happened to lambs as they develop into sheep, but the lamb is completely not understanding of its own fate, of its own trajectory. It's that perfect euphoric state of innocence. Now, lambs often are used to symbolize the character of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is often depicted as a lamb because Jesus was someone who was willing to sacrifice himself like a lamb for the greater good of others. Lambs are peaceful and docile, and that idea of willingness to be sacrificed for the redemption of others is very clear. So perhaps this song is developing into a more religious song to share the virtues of Jesus and his willingness to sacrifice himself for the sins of the rest of mankind. So pipe a song about a lamb. And almost without question, so I piped with merry cheer. So I piped shows that he is willing to take that direction for the child and is willing to tailor his music to satisfy those requests. So I piped. And he does so with merry cheer. And that merry cheer, I think, is now from both of these characters. The child is feeling merry from having his needs satisfied, and the piper is also cheerful because he's the one able to inspire that happiness in someone else. So this song is no longer this spontaneous outburst of music. It's now co-constructed. And it turned from a meaningless tune, and it's now turning into something much more consciously constructed. And him taking direction from the child improves the music, not just for himself, but for the child too. So everyone benefits when we work in tandem. The end of the second stanza continues in that pattern. The child says, Piper, pipe that song again. Like any child, they like to hear something that's pleasurable over and over and over again. So Piper, pipe that song again. So this child again directs the musician, and this time not to create something new, not to inspire something greater, but to enjoy that music for a second time. And the piper obliges. He says, so I piped. And then we get that colon, then we get that caesura, and then we move on to the next part of the poem. But so I piped again shows that he obliges, and he's happy to take direction to satisfy the happiness of that child. Now after this there is a slight change in tone, because for the first time we get something that could be considered negative. He says, he wept to hear. And there is an ambiguity about the word wept, because on the one hand, weeping can be for joy and happiness, but you can weep also due to disappointment. So this is where we can ask the question, does he weep because he's so happy about the music that he's been able to hear time and time again? Or does the child begin to weep because hearing the music for the second time perhaps is not quite as interesting or not quite as novel as the first time he heard it? And now we can start to open up that debate about innocence and experience. Hearing a song that you're absolutely in love with for the first time can never happen twice. That unadulterated first listen to a piece of music can only happen once. And then after that, you're hearing and listening to the same music twice. And that would be like if you took your favorite song and you listened to it non-stop for 16 days. At some point, that music will lose its magic and it'll become repetitive and perhaps mundane. So we can start to open up the dialogue about the innocence of hearing music for the first time is where true enjoyment comes from. And perhaps when you hear it more than once, when you become an experienced listener, perhaps you lose some of that magic. So already the debate of innocence and experience has started to rear its head. He wept to hear. Next imperative that is given by the child is drop thy pipe, thy happy pipe, sing thy songs of happy cheer. So the word drop is quite clear. He asks the piper now to abandon his musical instrument entirely, and instead he asks him to sing thy songs. There's a difference between piping music and singing songs. One requires that musical instrument, the second requires the singer to actually use words to form meaning. Now, this piece of art has evolved so far from a spontaneous outburst of joy, then to a much more fixed and rigid musical structure, and now there's a formal composition of fixed words as well. The music has evolved into this much more grand piece of art. He says, drop thy pipe, thy happy pipe. So the music is still associated with happiness. And that music inspires joy in the boy, and the innocent and the experienced piper, both innocent and experienced party, are getting the same level of happiness from this. But now it's time for him to sing thy songs. And again, that imperative verb, he's definitely being commanded to do so. And once more, the piper is happy to oblige. Can you see the anaphora that's developing once more? So I, but the phrase so I almost becomes repetitive in the way that we've got. It's in that fronted way. It's a little bit repetitive now. So I did it, so I did it, so I did it. So the experience itself is becoming much more repetitive. But he says, so I sung the same again. And now we've got this sibilance being used, so I sung the same again. Now, perhaps that's Blake's way of sharing some of the sounds from that song, or it could be a hint at the repetition of this music now is becoming a repeated experience, rather than that magical, ephemeral moment that was shared between the two. And perhaps the sibilance suggests perhaps a little bit of tedium, a little bit of repetition, a little bit less excitement, and a little bit more work behind creating this music. And again, we get the word wept being used. We have the phrase wept with joy, and that music continues to inspire joy. But again, that verb wept, it might suggest that the music has lost something as it's become more regulated and more fixed. It's very difficult to capture a moment. Our next stanza begins, piper, sit thee down and write in a book that all may read. Now we've got the divine inspiration of the child, again directing the piper to make the most of his creativity. It's almost like the child is coaching this piper on how to perfect his craft, how to change what was a simple song into something meaningful and something full of messages and full of profits. So, piper, sit thee down. Sit thee down is perhaps in juxtaposition to the wild meandering through valleys. Sit thee down is a movement away from spontaneity now, and much more focused on perhaps the concentration and the focus on what it takes to create truly excellent music or poetry. And perhaps there's a suggestion that this is the laborious part of actually writing the music now, actually sitting down and writing it properly. It's less active than wandering through the valleys, simply enjoying yourself. Piper, sit thee down and write in a book. The word write very clearly shows now we're moving into the formal composition of this music. And there's a much greater focus on transferring that experience that happened in the moment and actually trying to capture that experience on paper so that it can be shared with others. It's very difficult to share an experience with someone who wasn't there. And it's only a truly great, a truly genius writer who's able to share a momentary glimpse of the world with someone who didn't actually experience it to the point where they feel like they experienced it too. So sit thee down and write in a book that all may read. Now, to write it in a book is to preserve that experience forever. And there is a suggestion that that's actually turning an innocent moment into an experienced moment, being able to share that and explain and learn something from it. But to capture it in a book that all may read. And all may read suggests that this child believes that that moment, that song, those words that Blake has been inspired to write, deserves to be shared with the rest of the world. And Blake, throughout his life, never really gained much acclaim for his writing. And it was only towards the end of his life where he started to create a following of people who believed that he had something worthy of saying. And it's after his death that we've truly started to understand that what he was writing is really worthy of preserving. But Blake almost feels like, yeah, I need to share these ideas with the world. Now, Blake was an engraver. He didn't write his poetry in the way that other writers would have. He laboriously would have carved the words backwards onto copper plates so that they could be embossed and painted afterwards. It was a really painstaking process when he created his writing. And that could be an allusion to the fact that what he's writing is clearly worth reading. Otherwise, he wouldn't have placed so much work into it in order to capture it and share it with the world. So he vanished from my sight. So he vanished. At this moment, that angelic muse that existed in the sky, that came from heaven to experience that moment, that's when the inspiration disappears. That's when that moment of divine creation, that's when it disappears and leaves him perhaps alone with the memory, but without the experience itself anymore. So he vanished from my sight, and I plucked a hollow reed. Now the word plucked here is clearly onomatopoeic. And you can see this in a couple of different ways. Like a musical instrument needs to be plucked in order to be played, like a guitar. But the word plucked in this context probably means to take something, to remove something, perhaps to snap something. And what he plucks is a hollow reed. Now, a hollow reed is a very natural substance. So that means to create his pen in order to write his poetry, he takes something from nature to capture that experience. But by taking that from nature, he actually has to destroy the reed. He actually has to cut it. It's like seeing a beautiful flower in a garden and then deciding, no, I want to share this flower with someone else. So you cut the flower, essentially killing it, in order to share this living organism. So there is an element of that onomatopoeic plucked also being destructive. And he plucked a hollow reed. And the reed has the pre-modifying adjective hollow before it. Now, it needs to be hollow. Of course, it needs to be hollow. Reeds need to be hollow in order to transfer nutrients through the stem. And a pen needs to be hollow in order for the ink to flow out. But the word hollow also suggests an emptiness. So perhaps we get this idea that capturing the words is definitely possible, but capturing the true experience or the true innocence of that experience is impossible. And you almost end up with something that does reveal what it was like to be there, but it's not the thing itself. So what this piper does is he takes his writing materials from nature, just like he took his inspiration from nature to create this very natural poem that he's created. On the screen, I've put a picture of a water reed as well, just so you can see what they look like. As we approach the end of the poem, you can then see that the poem kind of takes a much more formal and rigid structure, and it becomes a little bit more repetitive. The next three lines begin with "and I," and that anaphora becomes much more frequent as the poem develops. And it's almost like the experience of recording these words is much more laborious, it's much more repetitive, and actually maybe the poem itself is less and less like the original experience itself. So perhaps the innocent, playful creation of the music at the beginning was effortless, and that turned that innocence into experience, and the experience isn't quite as satisfying as that moment of innocence itself. And I made a rural pen. The word made here is much different to the original spontaneous music at the beginning. The word made almost seems more mechanized, almost feels like this poetry now is about being manufactured rather than just created at the beginning for joy. And it's almost like it's manufactured rather than capturing that spontaneous inspiration now. And remember, written at a time during the Industrial Revolution where Blake would have seen the mechanization of the world and looked at it quite unfavorably, because as we have more and more machines, you actually remove the need for human beings. You walk into any supermarket checkout and you'll see more machines than human beings. And that was happening during the Industrial Revolution, particularly with weavers. The very skilled job of weaving was starting to become redundant because we had machines that could weave much quicker and much more efficiently and didn't demand pay like weavers did, to the point where a lot of weavers got together. They were called the Luddite riots, and they destroyed some of those machines because they felt like they were ruining their livelihoods. So the word made here could very much hint to the idea of industrial revolution. And I made a rural pen. And I like the word rural there. I think it reveals quite a lot. Rural is much different to the wild valley that we had at the beginning of this poem. I would argue that rural is much more gentle, much more tame compared to those wild valleys in that romantic sublime bower at the beginning. And if it's rural, we've got this idea that, okay, well, mankind has had an impact on the environment. We don't have the wilderness like we used to have back in ancient Greek times. Rural now is a place of farming, of agriculture. Now, the word pen can simply mean to write something using a writing implement, but it can also mean to enclose or to constrict or to capture something, like penning sheep in a pen. Just like he's trying to capture something that's impossible to capture, and he's trying to capture it and constrain it into words and meter and rhyme scheme. And I stained the water clear. You can see that the lexical set in this end of this poem is very different to the wild lexical set at the beginning of the poem. Stained means to tarnish in some way. If you stain clear water, it's destructive. Now, ink is needed to capture the moment. It definitely is. Without ink, you can't write a poem. But it also taints the experience. It taints the innocence. So it's almost like by writing the poem about that innocent experience, it actually takes some of the innocence away from it. It's one of the most impossible things that an artist can do, to create something that's completely unadulterated without their own art tainting it in some way. So when it says I stained the water clear, it's almost like that image itself has been stained, has been tarnished, has been destroyed in some way. And I stained the water clear. I mean, water clear is clear symbolism of purity and innocence. That river or that stream or that brook in this poem used to be clear and unadulterated and perfect, but now it's tainted slightly. And again, that could link to the idea of industrial revolution that did often taint things like rivers. If you take a look at the Thames at the time, it was clearly tainted by mankind. As we approach the final two lines, and I wrote my happy songs. So I wrote my happy songs. It gives us perhaps his purpose behind this anthology. It's to share his divine inspiration. It's to share his prophecies. It's to share the happiness and to share the understanding of nature. And it's to share that children are definitely worth listening to. And it almost gives us his mission throughout this anthology. It's to share his happy songs so that every child may joy to hear. So what he's trying to do is to share his vision and his talent with the world. Now, yes, by capturing that moment, he feels like perhaps it's been destroyed slightly because I've moved now away from innocence into experience. But what he can do is he can give every child across the country that innocent moment. So what he's trying to do is to take that one moment that only existed in a single moment of time and to replicate it so that people across the world will be able to experience that moment too, which seems like a very noble aim. So he wants to share his visions and share his talents with the world. And when it says every child may joy to hear, his focus very much is on bringing joy to the innocent and to preserve that innocence. He doesn't want to write poetry that will make children grow up and get a job. He doesn't want to write poetry to educate children on how horrible the world is. What he's trying to do is he's trying to preserve that innocence for as long as possible, because the world is a dangerous place. The world is full of darkness and it's full of danger and it's full of sinister intentions. What Blake wants to do is to share those positive ideas with the world and perhaps teach the world that we need to value childhood a little bit more. We need to protect children, stop sending them down coal mines, stop forcing them up chimneys to be chimney sweeps. Maybe it's time to preserve that innocence, because that innocence is so easy to be destroyed. As we come to the end of the poem, I'd like to share with you just a little bit more philosophical educational theory, perhaps, that Blake would have been exposed to at the time. Just when he thought I couldn't possibly add any more context, I'm going to add a little bit more. And I'm coming back again to that Enlightenment figure of John Locke, because John Locke had theories of education and children. And part of his theory was that the purpose of education is supposed to focus on cultivating rational thinking and moral virtues. The purpose of educating a child is to make them into mini adults, make them think clearly. And I think Blake resists that. I don't think he wants to rush children into adulthood. I actually think he wants to preserve children, not just turning them into these rational computer machines. Now, John Locke also suggested that education is about instilling discipline and responsibility and civic virtue into young people. And again, I think Blake is radical when it comes to that idea. I think he doesn't think the purpose of education is to discipline children, to stop them being what children are supposed to be. I think he argues for something different. And finally, he argued that children enter the world as what he refers to in the Latin as tabula rasa. Tabula rasa means blank slate. So John Locke believed that children are born as blank slates, and then as they are born, then experience imprints upon them, and then they learn things, and then they develop personalities afterwards. And I think Blake argues against it. I think Blake is telling us that no, children are born with something. They're born with an innate wonder. They're born with a magic. They're born with an innocence. They're born with something more than just emptiness. And that we need to look at children, and perhaps we can learn a little bit more about ourselves by taking a look at their innocence and their purity. So I would argue that John Locke is perhaps the opposite in his educational theory than Blake would have been. I think Blake's educational ideas are much more closely aligned with the educational philosophy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And in his text, Emile, he really clearly sets out what a education should be for people. Now, one of his major quotations that's often attributed to him is, "Everything is good as it leaves the hands of the author of things." Everything degenerates in the hands of man. And Blake was also really distrustful of authorities. He believed that schools and churches and charities, they actually tarnished children. They sought to control them, and they corrupted their souls. Now, Jean-Jacques Rousseau on education, he suggested that children are inherently good and that their natural instincts should be nurtured rather than suppressed. And if you think about the figure of the piper never told the child what makes good art or what makes good music. The piper never tried to educate the child or tell them that they're wrong or to change their views. The piper could see wisdom in that child, and he was happy to oblige to make his music better. It's the child that directs the adult in this poem. And I would suggest that Rousseau would say that's probably sensible, because in this poem, the child seems to know more than the adult. Rousseau also emphasized the importance of allowing children to explore their environments and encouraging hands-on learning and fostering their curiosity. And he argued against formal education systems that focused on rote memorization and strict discipline, and instead he argued for a more holistic and individualized approach that respects the child's natural inclinations. And again, I think I see that in the piper. The piper allows the child to direct him to make something that the child wants, not what the adult wants. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau also argued that children possess an intrinsic wisdom. And that's not just in this poem, you'll see it all the way through Blake's poetry. Perhaps it's time to listen to children. Perhaps it's time to listen to the magic of innocence and childhood, because that's where true wisdom comes from. Take a look what the adults have done in 1789. We have a political system that seems to be corrupt. We have riots in the streets. We have famine in London. We have war in France. We have a royal family that doesn't seem to care about the poorest in society. I think what Jean-Jacques Rousseau and what Blake see is perhaps adults don't have the answers. Perhaps adults have the problems. And perhaps children are born with an innocent virtue that we should actually take inspiration from. Brings us to the end of what I wanted to share with you about this poem. Now, I'm completely aware that I've gone into a horrific amount of depth, and I've pulled in a lot of contextual factors that I think are important to know when it comes to understanding the poem. So just as a quick roll call, we've looked at the Industrial Revolution and the pollution of London, and we've juxtaposed that to Blake's writing of a pastoral poem that seems to be more indicative of the ancient Greek writings of Theocritus, to show that the world has been corrupt by mechanization, and that actually maybe we can find a solution to all of our problems by looking at the natural world and maybe choosing a more simple and harmonious way of life. Now, I've introduced you to some philosophical context as well. So, for example, the rationalist thought of John Locke and other Enlightenment figures, and how they believed that it was through science and through technology and through engineering, and it was through rational thought that you can actually come to true understanding, and how perhaps Romantic poets would argue something different, that it's not through logic that we're going to understand the world, it's through a consideration of emotion, and it's a consideration of what we don't know in the world that actually allows us to get to a greater sense of understanding. We've briefly mentioned the difference between the first and the second generation poets. We've gone into a huge amount of depth. Now, all of this has been designed to maximize your mark in 3 particular areas, because in section A, part 1 of your essay, you need to show real detailed engagement with language, form, and structure, and also understand how this poem, in terms of literary technique, how it's been created and what it achieves, what it attempts to achieve. And I feel like we've been successful in going over that. Now, secondly, and most importantly, the larger essay that you're going to write on the poetry of William Blake, the section A, part 2 question, it really does need you to understanding a lot of the context, because context is weighted really heavily. In the 45-mark essay, it's worth 30 marks. And if there's one thing the WJEC say all of the time, it's that engagement with literary context rather than simple biographical context that really does hint at the top of the mark scheme. So looking for that band 5, we really do need to be mentioning romantics and their fighting against Enlightenment ideals. And we do need to be talking about the philosophical context and educational theories of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. That's where those really special essays will shine. It's when you understand that literary context. So hopefully this video gets you a little bit closer to where you want to be, and hopefully it sets you out to help you on your way to understanding the beginning of Songs of Innocence. I will make plenty more videos. They'll be with you as soon as I possibly can. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope you found it informative. I will see you in the next video. Thank you very much for listening.